Welcome, everyone. It's a pleasure to be welcoming you today in the second online event of our recently launched Executive MBA Talks. My name is Lida, and I manage recruitment and admissions for our Executive MBA programs here at RSM. Thank you to everyone who is joining us today from their home or office space. It's great to see people that have been in touch with us one way or another. It's also nice to see new names. And if this is your first interaction with a school, even better, you chose a very good event. Today, we're welcoming RSM's Director of Coaching, Hetty Brand-Boswijk, who will share her insights on how business leaders can support their team members through times of change. The discussion is moderated by Brandon Kirby, Director of MBA Marketing and Admissions. Brandon was our speaker in our first Executive MBA Talk on Public Speaking and Presentation Skills Design last week. And with that, I will now hand over to you, Brandon.
That's great, Lida. Thank you so much for inviting me back. I guess I didn't do so bad the first time, so I was allowed to come back and be in front of the camera again. And welcome to everyone joining us this afternoon, this morning, this evening, depending on where you are logging in from. And as Lida pointed out, this is the second in our ongoing series of MBA Talks, which is really designed to bring practical and actionable concepts to your professional routine. So the first one was on presentation design and presentation skills. And today we're speaking on a topic that is particularly relevant in the world in which we find ourselves in. And that, of course, is leading teams in times of crisis. And it's important to remember that crisis can affect all of us in different ways, as individuals, but also as teams. And so leaders need to be able to think not just about themselves, but also the crisis at hand and the teams in which they lead. So today, with our speaker, with Hetty, who I'll introduce in just a moment, we're going to be speaking about different aspects of leading teams in the way that you can improve and the way you can approach really helping your teams to not only deal with the current situation, but to also thrive in the current situation. So who are we? Again, I'm Brandon Kirby. I've already introduced myself, so that should be pretty clear who I am. But also joining me via Zoom webcam is Hetty Brand-Boswijk, who has her coaching certifications as CPC, PCC, CNTC. And Hetty, you might have to explain to me all of the different certifications and what those acronyms are. But basically, you're the Director of Coaching here at RSM. You've been with us for quite some time. You have a lot of experience to share. You advise the faculty as well as the programs teams on our personal leadership development program, particularly in the area of leadership and coaching programs. And I didn't know this actually until I was looking at your bio, that you're also the president of the board of the International Coaches Federation here in the Netherlands. So even I learned something new when I was learning a little bit about you. Hetty, would you like to say hello and introduce yourself to the group today?
Yeah, thanks, Brandon, and thanks to you and Lida also for inviting me to come and talk about a topic that is very close to my heart this evening. About those acronyms, they're first basically the CPCC is my certification, the PCC is my ICF credential, and the CNTC is a certification in neurotransformational coaching. I'm a bit of a neuroscience geek when it comes to coaching. So, and I'm very proud of all of them. So I always put them there. Like you say, I've been at RSM for a number of years. And what I really love about that is that not only have I been at RSM as a whole for a number of years, but I've also have experience in the MBA programs office, in marketing and admissions, in business development, and now in the coaching center. So I've seen a lot going on at RSM over the years, and that has actually supported me in where I've come to right now in basically partnering with individual students and teams of students. And that's what we actually do with the whole program. So good to be here this evening.
I know you and I have had a lot of conversations as I've been here at RSM because you are truly a wealth of knowledge. So I was really excited to have you agree to join us and to share some insights, not only from your experience, but also from your professional training, which I know has helped me as a leader, but will also, I'm sure, help those who are joining us this evening as well. So real quick, just as you know, as we should, good housekeeping. Here's the agenda for this evening. We've already covered the introductions In just a moment, I'll share a little bit about the housekeeping items to keep in mind throughout the webinar. Then we'll get into the real presentation part, which is around 7 actions for leaders. So 7 things that Hetty is going to speak about that you can take back into your professional life, round it out with key takeaways, and then finally address any questions that you might have. Now, speaking of which, Lida mentioned at the beginning that we are recording the series for posterity. However, when we do put them online, we do remove the chat bar and everything else, so it's completely anonymous, so no one will know you were here. We're very keen on making sure that we respect everyone's privacy, but we were also contacted by several people who were unable to join us who would like to be able to watch this afterwards. So please know that we respect your confidentiality and your privacy in that matter. We'll also be doing polls along the way. Polls for me is a great way to A, make sure that we engage with you, B, make sure you're not falling asleep, but perhaps most importantly, C, to find out who's in the audience today. So I'm actually going to launch a poll here, as a matter of fact, while I'm speaking. You should see it on your screen. We have noticed that if you're not in Chrome, if you're in Internet Explorer or Firefox, sometimes with the Zoom platform, there's issues with seeing the poll. So if you don't see the poll on your screen, I apologize. It's definitely something that I think Zoom is working on. So we'll let you vote for just a moment while I continue with the housekeeping items. Please feel free to ask any questions that you would like throughout the program today. There's a Q&A box or Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, which you can press. You can ask your questions in there. I will do my best as the moderator to bring them into the discussion. If you have general comments you would like to make, feel free to put them in the chat window. I'll also be able to bring in different remarks that you might have. But if you have a question, use the Q&A. If it's a general comment, use the chat box. And other than that, I think we're pretty much ready to begin, if I'm not mistaken. So Hetty, let's kind of move forward, shall we? So whenever we do webinars, I think it's always good to give context and to provide a setting and a foundation for all of us to work from as we have this conversation over the next 45 minutes or so. And we're going to spend a lot of time talking about coaching and how leaders can coach their teams through crisis. So I think it's important perhaps for you to provide a little foundation for the audience today about what do we mean about coaching skills.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mentioned just now also about partnering with individual and teams of students. And for us at RSM, that partnering is in the coaching is a thought-provoking and creative process that inspires individuals and teams to maximize personal and professional potential. And there are a number of main coaching skills. And they are curiosity, listening, and asking questions. And I know that sounds very simple, but it's about how and when you actually use the questioning, how and when you use the listening skills, and the curiosity is sort of the umbrella around that. How are we as leaders getting curious about the people that we lead? And, we can be distracted by all kinds of business issues. And we get interested in certain things that are to do with the business, with the bottom line. But when we're working with people, when we're leading teams, and not actually only leading teams, it's also, in peer-to-peer, just work relationships. The biggest question is, what is going on? What's going on with you? What's going on with me? And how is this having an impact on the effectiveness of our relationship?
And that makes sense. I think oftentimes people do overlook the power of questions, especially when you're trying to understand someone's viewpoint or really trying to dig beyond, Hetty, how are you today? Oh, I'm okay. Well, maybe you are, maybe you aren't, but to use questions and use powerful questions to really give insight into the other person is really critical.
And it's also about thinking about the kind of questions and the impact that it has on somebody. I was talking to someone recently about, what's your favorite coaching question? And I sort of said the word "and." Mm-hmm. Because when you ask someone a question and they give you their first answer, there is always more.
Yeah.
Very powerful to say to someone, "and," or "what else?" And these are, very short questions, 1 or 2 words. They're very powerful to trigger people to think further, think deeper, and that sort of thing. So,
And I think that's, again, another great point is to, and to do it perhaps in a good way, but to always dig deeper and to really not just accept that first answer necessarily. And I think it also forces the other person, especially if you're asking them, what are you looking to do with your career? Well, I'm looking to do this. Well, and what else? And what else? Because you want to explore those possibilities.
Yeah.
So let's bring in the results here real fast from the first poll that we had. And with about almost 3/4 of the people responding, most people are saying that they're currently leading a small team. About 50% of our audience is in that category, followed by people who have yet to had an opportunity to lead. So these are people who are aspiring leaders. So I think this is also very relevant for them. So things that they can take away and put into practice before they even step into a true leadership role. And then finally, a few people who are leading a large team, and then a few people who have led a team in the past, but are not leading a team at the moment. So a good mixture of people today.
Yeah.
So let's talk about these 7 actions for leaders. I remember when we were talking about this and looking at this, I was trying to ask myself how many of these things I do as a leader. I don't think I could tick all 7 boxes. So I, like everyone else, I have room for improvement as well. But the first one is about prioritizing the health and well-being for effective teamwork. What do we mean by that? When we talk about, most people think about prioritizing KPIs and results and things like that, but you're advocating for something a little different, if I understand correctly.
Well, yes. I mean, when we get into work, into what we do, very often the business, the company that we work for, they have their bottom line, they have their KPIs, their goals, etc. And as employees, as colleagues, as team members, this is like sort of on the top of our heads. This is like, I'm going to work for this company to do this task, and that's my goal. We set goals at the beginning of each year and say, okay, this is what we're going to be assessed on at the end of the year. And I'm not saying that's wrong. It's absolutely not wrong. But we're talking about leadership in times of crisis. And we know from the past 3 or 4 months that things can change. And sometimes you need to pivot between what your priorities are. And I think, when we're going back into work, we're slowly but surely going back into office situations, albeit in a different mode than we were used to. I think it's important to realize to stop for a moment, just take stock and say, okay, let's just step back and just sort of basically ask the question, how are you? How am I? How are you? Before we get back into the focus on prioritizing the bottom line. There's going to be a lot of changes for companies that are, we're in the recession. They're going to have to change maybe some of their processes. Some companies will be restructuring. And just to say for a moment, hang on a minute, how are we doing as people? Prioritize that health and well-being, because if you just forget it or look past it or don't give it the attention that it needs and deserves, then you may find that in a month or 2 time, people are starting to fall by the wayside. And one of the reasons for this is that when we went into this crisis in particular, a lot of people were shocked. And we all saw a lot of people pulling up their sleeves and saying, okay, we're going to go for this. We can do this. We can work from home. We can step up to the plate. And it was pushed by the adrenaline that's created by shock. So sort of going to this fight, flight, freeze kind of mode, and we fight and we go for it. What happens when you start to get used to it is that the adrenaline reduces. And once you've had a high adrenaline, it tends, when it reduces, you get fatigued. And if we don't prioritize health and well-being now first, that fatigue will kick in even further down the line, and people will start falling by the wayside. They will start getting sick. Burnout will become prevalent, maybe even things as bad as depressions, etc. So if you prioritize it now, focus on the people, then there is a possibility that you can actually mitigate worse circumstances in the future.
I think you're right. We're in this situation where, as I describe it to colleagues of mine, it's like you're on a ship and you've pushed off from the land, and the land was pre-COVID, and we're now in the ocean that is this global pandemic. So you can't see the land behind you, but you can't see the land ahead of you to know where is this journey going to end. And I think it can be really hard to keep people motivated, to keep people, mentally healthy, the well-being you're saying. So what is, in your experience, what is an indicator, or what is something that a manager, is it a change in performance? Is it people aren't as engaged as they used to be? What are some things that might be a tip off that one of your employees or one of people on your team is maybe, starting to get into some of those things that you were mentioning?
Well, I think one of the things you mentioned about, not being engaged is certainly one of the things that you could notice. I think I would probably put it under the umbrella word resistance. Human beings can be resistant to change, and now they've had no choice. So everything else around that, they might be resistant to. They might be resistant to coming back to the office. They might be resistant to, for instance, it's possible that if companies are restructuring and they're going to have to let people go, that the people who are left are going to have to take on extra work. And so this is going to have an impact on their whole lives. And if you find resistance to this, but the other part is also they're going to be showing it in their physical demeanor. If you see someone who is usually quite bright and happy and enjoys their job, you see them coming in and they've got this kind of face. It's like, that's a signal. That's a subconscious flag. And as leaders of teams, we need to be looking out for these. We need to be conscious that this is going to happen. I don't say might, I'm saying is. Even if it's just 1 out of 100, this is going to happen. People are going to be feeling the effect of this crisis. And it's going to play out into everything, into their private life, into their work life. It's going to play out everywhere.
Yeah, absolutely. It's unfortunately, it's kind of the collateral damage, if you will, of the world we find ourselves in. So we're talking a lot about people. And oftentimes when we think about human capital and we think about results and, we measure, again, outputs and outcomes, not necessarily looking at who the people are. And one of the next tips you're saying, and the next actions to consider, is identifying the human being versus the human doing. What do you mean by that?
Well, our world, our societies are based on being a human doing. When someone asks you, for instance, to tell them a little bit about you, you'll tell them what you do. And in fact, what we do describes us, but it doesn't define us. There is a whole part of us as a person that is a human being. It's more the emotional side, what we're feeling, what our values are. And when I say what we're feeling, not just what we know here that we're feeling, but what we're really feeling in our hearts, what we're feeling on the inside, and what we're feeling in our gut. We talk about gut feeling. Well, it's intuition. And somebody's intuition might be very different than the way they present themselves at work. We're, as human doings, we are extremely good at pretending we're okay. You said earlier, somebody asks you, how are you? And you go, I'm fine. And inside you're screaming and you're going, no, I'm not fine. I'm anxious. My life is falling apart. That's the human being. And yet, if we don't recognize that human being is there, it will ultimately have an impact on what they're doing. They won't be functioning in the way that they have in the past. Maybe they are functioning in the same way. So you could ask your question, okay, so what's going on here? What are they ignoring? That will ultimately be detrimental to their physical and mental health. I would be surprised if anybody wasn't touched in some way or other by what we've just been through as the globe in the last 3 to 4 months. So the human being is who they are, and the human doing is what they do. And so, ultimately, the two come together as the integrated person. But if one is out of balance, if somebody is in doing tasks far more than focusing on who they are, then this could crash. And on the other side, it's also true, it's all about balance, is that if somebody is totally focused on their fears and on their feelings and everything, then the tasks, ultimately they could crash into a burnout. So it's about finding balance, but it's also about knowing and realizing that your employees, your team members, do a task, but are a person.
So we're talking a lot about observation and really trying to get below the surface. From your experience, what's a good way to open up that conversation, especially if the person you're interacting with is a closed person? I've led a lot of different teams with a lot of different personalities, and sometimes you can know that something is up, but until you get that permission, so to speak, to have that conversation, you're never going to know if it's work related or if it's their dog passed away last night. How do you work towards having that conversation? What would be your recommendation to someone trying to bridge that communications gap?
Well, you said a very important word there, and that's permission. You do need permission, and it's not may I ask permission to, but it's to engage with someone. And here's one of the coaching skill of asking questions really comes in here. When you're noticing as a team leader that one of your team members is just not, it's just a little off kilter, then the curiosity and the questioning comes in. And, you can bring it around to asking someone about, say, what's going on? Or even, I noticed that you're not as bright as you usually are. Is there something that I can help with? That's a yes or no question. So that's a closed question. So I would also say, think about how you would approach asking someone what's going on by using an open question. I often use the question, what's going on? What's going on with you today? That is also important about today, is stay in the moment. Because from this moment, this is all we've got, we can move forward. Very often you can't change what's in the past, but you can support someone moving forward. And so it's getting curious and asking what's going on. And if they won't tell you, if they can't tell you, then you don't have permission. And then somehow you need to find a way to work around that.
And that is a challenge sometimes. And that does happen,
And it doesn't always work. If someone is an introvert and they're a very closed person, we're all quite used to, many of us are used to working in multinational teams, and the cultural aspect comes in there as well. And what comes up for me right now is, how open are you being? How are you being a role model? And how are you creating psychological safety within the team to give everyone that opportunity to be who they are? Yeah. That's also important. I mean, how closed are you being? Are you being sort of above the team and closing off your feelings? Which is something that we'll get to later in our conversation. But are you giving the opportunity, without going straight to the person and saying what's going on with you, is in the team giving the opportunity to have that psychological safety for people to share.
Now, we've talked a lot about listening, and you're suggesting that you need to listen to the whole person and maybe not just what their voice is saying. So what do you mean, listen to the whole person? Help me understand that. Well,
as I said earlier, we are a human being and we're a human doing. And that's integrated into a complete human being, a complete person. The whole person is not just what they say. What's going on inside, that your body is your brain, is your body, there is heart, brain, there is intuition and everything. And very often, it's not actually that difficult to observe if you open your mind to it, to observe whether someone's words are actually connecting with heart and gut and intuition. They're often connecting with the head, because that's where the knowledge and the thoughts are coming from. But for instance, if you ask someone, how are you doing? And that person says, fine, thanks. I mean, is the face saying what the words are saying? So, nowadays we live in this virtual world. We can only see like sort of this much of the person. So what's actually, check in with what's resonating for you. I call it's an extra dimension to listening, and I call it see listening or see hearing. And it's about using your eyes and your intuition as well as your ears. Because when you're listening to somebody talk, just by any non-verbal communication on their face or in their shoulders, when you're like this, they're sitting there talking to you like this, or are they relaxed? Are their voices relaxed, or is the pitch higher? So all these non-verbal communication signals are something that you need to learn to pick up on. And actually, we do it automatically. It's just that when you're responsible for working with people and for holding the safe space for them, it's good to just be aware to do that a little bit extra. A coaching skill, it's also a coaching skill. And something that I notice is that when I'm talking with people, is that they're talking all about everything. And then I'll just look at them and I go, well, what's uncomfortable about that for you? And they're sort of looking at me as if to say, how do you know that I'm uncomfortable? Well, there is this thing about these flecks in your neck, these red marks. Now, if you've seen those, then it will give you extra information about what that person is going through internally. Their words may not be saying, I'm feeling uncomfortable right now, but their body will.
Yeah. It's again, picking up on all these visual cues. We have a comment here in the room saying that they're enjoying, from Pavel saying, I'm enjoying the conversation quite much. How close is this to a typical class on campus? Would we have open conversations like this? And I think the answer is, without a doubt, yes. And whether it's about finance or operations, there's always going to be open conversations, but especially around PLD. And it can be in a group setting, a classroom setting. It can be in an individual setting, you with your own coach. So absolutely, this is something that we see, in the classroom setting. So we've talked about listening. We've talked about awareness. I guess we're going to keep with the senses. Let's talk about seeing your team. So, okay, I walk into the office, or maybe not now. Maybe I log into my Zoom team meeting, and I see everyone. I mean, what do you mean by seeing your team members? I'm sure there's some coaching. There's something coming on this that goes beyond just using my eyes. But what do you mean by truly see your team members?
Do you know the value of your team members? The real value? Do you know them as a whole person? Do you know what they're bringing to the team? This is about seeing your team members. Generally human beings want to be seen and want to be heard. And that is what I mean about this, is don't just look at them, but see them. Don't just listen to them, hear them. Give them the space to be valued, to feel valued. See them for the creative, resourceful people that they are. They were born naturally, they were naturally creative and resourceful. So see them as a whole. And the thing I love about this is that, you say, I come into the office, you say good morning to everybody, and when we're at the office, or you come on Zoom. When you come on Zoom, and this is a completely different topic, this is about, online presence, as it were. But when you come on Zoom, what are you looking at? What are you seeing? Are you seeing the distracted team member on their phone? Are you seeing, for instance, on Zoom, this is one of the things I really love, on Zoom, are you seeing what sort of pictures they've got hanging in their house? Or whether they've got houseplants, or whether they've got a cat sitting in the background somewhere. This is all about who they are. So when you truly see your team members, you're seeing who they are and not what they do. So you're seeing what defines them as a human, as a person, and not just how they add value to the work, to the bottom line, to the goal that you have been given by your boss.
So how can you take that and how can you use that? What's been your experience? So if I see someone, I guess maybe you can use that as a way to gain that permission, so to speak, to have it. So if you see someone has a lot of art on the wall, that could be an opening for a conversation to sort of bring you closer together. So I do a lot of interviews with MBA candidates, and I was doing an interview with a woman from Brazil. She was a PhD holder, a very technical field. And behind her, she had this really interesting picture of a rhinoceros. And I asked her, I said, "Oh, is that a rhinoceros?" And she said, "Actually, yes, I drew that." She took it down off the wall and showed it to me. And, it provided an extra connection point because it was just a little visual cue, but I was able to bring it in. I'm guessing these are the kind of things that you're talking about.
Can I use that example?
Sure.
Just to pivot the way you could have done that. Not that was wrong, because that's absolutely great. But when you see something like that, my curiosity would get the better of me. And I would say, that's a really interesting painting you've got there. What's important about that to you? Because when you say, is that a rhinoceros? She could have just said yes.
True.
But when you say, that's really interesting, what's important about that to you? Then you invite them to share far more about themselves. You invite them to share maybe a deep passion that they have for something. And that really opens up the psychological safety in the relationship. And it opens up the possibility they see that you're hearing them. They see that you're curious about them as a whole person, which means they're going, "Oh, wait a minute, my boss wants to know about my hobbies." And this is a very fast, this happens very fast in the brain, and the connection between the brain and the heart. They're not sitting there thinking into themselves, "Oh, my boss is really interested in me." No, it's an instant connection that will make them feel more comfortable. And once they're more comfortable, they are actually saying, "I'm going to tell you about my rhinoceros painting," which gives you permission to ask more.
See, even I learned something. This is great. Not just the people in the audience. I get to learn something as well. So here's a tough one, I think. And this is about looking at team values, which you should be creating together, of course, as a group. This shouldn't be mandated from top down. This is something that everyone should come together and really talk about. How do we want to work? What's the boundaries? How do we want to communicate? What is the expectation of one another? Those kind of things. So those team values. But you're advocating saying, well, it's a new world, at least for the time being. So you might want to go back to that rule book, if you will, that you might have sitting on the shelf with the team and reevaluate those values. So what do you mean by this? How can you go about doing it? How can you determine what stays, what goes, what changes? Let's talk about reevaluating team values.
Well, I'm making an assumption here that as a team lead, you will have at some point, worked out what your team values are to the point where you understand what is required for your team to be the high-functioning, high-performing team that you want. It makes me also think about what we do in the Executive MBA PLD, where when you change teams with each term, we have an opportunity with team coaching to do some team building and working on what are the team values to come up with a team charter. And that's sort of your team's agreements, rules of engagement for that particular term. So I'm making the assumption here that you know what your team's values are. So what has happened? We're talking about leading in times of crisis. And what's happened in this last 3 or 4 months is that individuals' values may have shifted. Whereas somebody in the past may not have had a second's thought about, their health with regards to their work, etc. the last 3 or 4 months may have made them shift completely to the point where my health, in combination with my work, is now one of my top core values. You will have some personal core values that will be embedded in your character, in your personality. But above that, you have some core values that will change over time depending on the season of life you're in and depending on your situation, your environment. And your environment has changed. So it stands to reason that your values, your personal values, may change. So you're coming back into the team you've been working with for 5 years. And those team values that you all know really clearly, you just carry on where you left off. But the person whose own core values have shifted is sitting there feeling, yeah, hang on a minute. This is not the way I want to work moving forward. So once you have gotten to know what's going on with each individual person in the team, then it would behoove you to actually sit down with the team and say, okay, let's have some sharing, which is also caring. And let's just have a look at the way we worked in the past. Is that going to serve us moving forward? Or is there something we need to recalibrate? Are there new agreements that we need to make with each other as a team as a whole? What new things do we need to take into account? If you ignore this and you just move forward as you did in the past, it's likely that there may be some cracks in the teamwork in the future. And if you can mitigate that by focusing on it now, A, your team knows that you care and that you're really there for them. And B, you're far more likely not to have the cracks coming up in the teamwork in the future, which ultimately gives you the path to effectiveness in the team and the success with the goals in the future.
No, I agree. You can use this time of uncertainty to bring people closer together, and in some ways, you can come out stronger for it because of working together and sort of going through a challenging situation together, and you come out a much tighter sort of unit, if you will. I'm going to launch
don't assume that everybody is going to come back to work after the big heat of the crisis, the great lockdown, or even moving forward. Things have changed. So, don't make the mistake of assuming that everything's just going to carry on as normal.
Very true. Speaking of change, I'm going to launch the second poll. And while people answer, I'm going to bring a question in from the chat room here for you. So the poll that we're going to launch now is, has your approach, if you're not leading a team, or if you are leading a team, or you're thinking, if you're not leading a team, has it changed since COVID-19? So has your approach or thinking towards leadership changed since the outbreak, the craziness that we're going through? Now, in the meantime, while people vote on that, before we go to the next slide, here's a question coming from Emma. I'll read this to you and give you a moment to process. It says, I have a question regarding my role as a manager in this crisis. I manage a very large team, 150 full-time employees, working in a very uncertain sector due to COVID. I feel that everyone is very insecure about the company and even their own jobs. The whole company knows that a reorganization will be happening in the near future, but it's still uncertain or insecure if it will hit her team. What's the best way of communicating to a large team like she has? And how do I handle all of the uncertainty within the team? I think transparency is very important, but that's not always fully possible. So again, this is, unique times in some ways, because it is, with the financial crisis, it was just a numbers thing. But now we have the health aspect that you've brought into the conversation as well. So when you're trying to balance, transparency, things that you may know that may or may not happen, how do you find the line between sharing, not sharing, calming people down, but also, keeping a realistic outlook? Because at the same time, I'm sure you wouldn't suggest going in and acting like nothing is wrong, because of course, if the other shoe drops, then everyone's really taken off guard. So what would your suggestion be to someone leading a large team dealing with uncertainty of a possible reorg, maybe there's redundancies. How would you recommend that they look at that?
Well, thanks, Emma, for your question. It's really important, particularly for you as an individual, to know and to get some support in this. So there are two things that are coming up for me. One of them is the word authenticity or honesty. This is hard for you as well. So don't underestimate what it's doing to you, what it's doing for you. And if you can't be totally transparent, at least look at about how authentic you're being. You know, sometimes if there is that expression, a problem shared is a problem halved. And coming down and being the commander-in-chief in the trenches with the soldiers sometimes will give them the trust, the confidence, the faith in you as a leader. You know, and sometimes people say, well, we want strong leaders and everything, but there are times to be a strong leader, and there's a time to be an authentic and an honest leader. And there is absolutely no shame in being vulnerable. You know, the vulnerability is actually a strength. And when people see you as a leader being vulnerable, they know you get it. And you may not be able to be totally transparent about what's going on, you know, but at least they will have faith in you. And the authenticity and the honesty will bring them that feeling of, okay, so Emma's in our court, Emma's on our side, you know, not that there has to be sides, but they will see that you are identifying with what they're going through. Even though that you have another position, you have the leadership position, be vulnerable, get authentic, and they will have faith in you, even though you may not be able to stop a redundancy or whatever. Check in with your empathy. Bring compassion into the conversation. Be the human being.
Yeah. And we also have talked a lot about listening, and I think it's also a good opportunity to just listen to the staff. You know, obviously you probably can't have 150 people come by your office individually, but just giving them the forum, whether it's at, you know, a Zoom session or if it's, you know, at the water cooler, just to sort of for them to put some of those anxieties and fear for you to soak up. I think you have to soak up a little bit of that sometimes as a leader, and just having an ear is sometimes, you know, might be enough. It might be all you can provide sometimes, especially if you have privileged information that you're not allowed to share.
This is about leading with emotional intelligence.
Correct.
Sometimes we become leaders because we're good at the task and that sort of stuff. But ultimately, you know, going from an operations kind of position, managing people to where you lead people, it's the shift from letting go of the details and going more into an emotional intelligence and being the person for them. You know, you make the strategy, you look at the umbrella picture, the big picture. But these people need to be heard. You're absolutely right, Brandon. They want to be seen and heard, and maybe just seeing and hearing them authentically, using empathy, which is part of your emotional intelligence package. Sometimes that's already enough.
And for those who I hope that everyone's at least heard of emotional intelligence, but of course, these are sort of the intangibles that really help to make you a successful leader. So self-reflection, self-regulation, empathy, communication, and people skills. These are all part of the pillars of emotional intelligence. And you make a great point. Go ahead, please.
And Brandon, it's a good point. You pointed that out. For anybody who's interested, Daniel Goleman, who is the sort of father of emotional intelligence, on Harvard Business Review, there are a number of articles that are quite, you know, they were written a number of years ago, but they're still very valid. And the one I like to recommend to people is What Makes a Leader, and then Leadership That Gets Results. They're two articles that talk about emotional intelligence in leadership, and then about leadership competencies from an emotional intelligence perspective.
That's a great suggestion. So let's share the results here real quick from the poll. maybe no surprise here, but about almost half the people who are joining us have changed their approach or thinking to leadership since COVID-19. So clearly we have the right audience here. They're already thinking about either making those changes. About 30% of our audience actually has not. So either that means they're already sort of doing some of the things that you're mentioning, or have yet to have the opportunity for that. So just good to know that I think what you're saying is probably resonating with quite a number of people who are listening in at the moment. So let's talk about motivation. In times of crisis, in times of change, in times of uncertainty, motivation can very quickly erode. You lose sight of you can still do the tasks, but maybe you lose sight of the overall goal. Why am I still doing this? Especially if you're in a situation where you're working from home and it's like Groundhog Day. You get up every day at the same day. You brush your teeth, you eat your breakfast, you log in. Maybe you're eating breakfast while you're checking your email. And then the day is just a blur. It's over with. You have a few hours on your own, and then you get up and it's the same thing. And I just described my day, right? That's my work week essentially. And for most people, I think most people would probably recognize that. So how can we motivate from a place of empowerment? And what do you mean by from a place of empowerment when you're talking about motivation, not only for yourself but for those around you?
When I talk about a place of empowerment, I'm talking about as a leader saying, "I need you." I mean that's it in a nutshell. Empowering someone to the middle part of that word is power, giving away the power to someone else for their own destiny. They can choose to sit back, be resistant, and all that sort of stuff, or you can give them the motivation to choose from a place of positivity. Now, all of what we've discussed before this is part of creating that environment of people choosing to move forward from a place of positivity. Even if there are discussions, rumors about restructuring, redundancies, and all sort of things like that, they can still feel empowered, because if someone is going to lose their job, they have a choice. They have a choice to be negative about it and fall apart, or they have a choice to be positive about it and see it as a new opportunity. And your position as a leader in this time is to see them, hear them, and guide them to a point where they're going to be able to see the power that they have in themselves. You have opened up new possibilities for them just by seeing and hearing them. And this motivates them. Now, the coaching skills, particularly the you've done all the listening, now it's about the questioning, particularly the powerful questions, not the ones that are in the moment, but the ones that are about the future. So it's about their being first, and this is now where you get to the human doing. So what are you going to do about it? What's your next step? What action do you need to take to feel, to move forward in a positive way? And that also is how you know that you can give them the faith that they need in themselves. It's giving away the power. You see them, now you get them to see themselves.
And getting them to see themselves, I think, is a big part of that, is, to have them reconnect with who they are, and to find that motivation from within, not just from those external stimuli or things that are coming in. Now, just a moment ago, we talked a little bit about emotional intelligence. And of course, a big part of emotional intelligence is self-reflection. And this is a big part of what we teach in the program. Going back to that question that someone asked earlier, is this the kind of conversations they can expect in an MBA program? For me, having done an MBA program myself and being part of the RSM family in that regards, this was a critical learning for me, was, to look in the mirror versus, looking to others. So let's talk about that. We have about 10 minutes left. So talk about this. We'll see if we have any questions from chat. We can start wrapping it up. But what do you mean when you say look in the mirror?
Well, everything I've spoken about is valid for every single human being. And that includes you. You are a leader of a team, or you're looking to lead a team, or you have in the past. It doesn't matter whether you have a team or not. You're responsible for leading your own life. The impact that you have on your environment, whether it be your family environment or your work environment. So the first thing to do is look in the mirror, and what you see there, see yourself, hear yourself, prioritize your own health and well-being. You know, if you are leading a large team, like the question we got from Emma, if you are leading a large team, if you ignore yourself at your peril, basically, because if you ignore yourself and you're giving everything to your team members or to your colleagues or whatever, and you don't prioritize your own health or well-being, you don't see your own human being as well as your own human doing, you don't recalibrate your own values, all of what we've spoken about. I'm not going to sort of predict what will happen, but I do have an idea. And, you know, the word burnout comes to mind. And you might, you know, society, you know, talks about self-care being selfish, and you're a leader and you've been given this responsibility and you've got to look after your people and everything. Yes, and you also have to look after yourself. Self-care is the most selfless thing that you can do, because it's quite simple. You can't pour from an empty cup. If you don't take care of yourself, you're the first one that will burn out. You're the first one that will suffer the health issues that you get from burning the candle at both ends. So, you know, to be the role model leader that you want to be, it's about looking in the mirror first and saying, okay, so what do I have to prioritize with me first?
You know, we asked at the beginning the different experience level people had with leadership. And I think probably 2/3 of people were leading a team of some sort or had led a team in the past. We spent a lot of time talking about, you know, leading and managing others through this crisis. But as leaders ourselves, who can we turn to, right? Because you still have perhaps the same anxieties, you know, the question about redundancies earlier. For all we know, that person might also be wondering, hey, will I even be here to lead, you know, forget the department, will I be here?
Yeah.
So it's challenging sometimes. They say it's lonely at the top. So what would be one or two things that you might recommend to someone before we go into the kind of the wrap up here with the key takeaways? What is one or two things you might recommend to someone in a leadership position that might not have someone above them to be able to provide some of the support and some of the actions that we've described in our session this evening?
Well, I don't think it will come as a surprise to you or anyone else when I say find yourself a coach. But I do want to qualify that because, you know, and to sort of qualify what coaching is. Often, and especially many years in the past, coaching was sought for people who, you know, had problems and we want to deal with the problems, etc. Coaching is about having someone put that mirror up for you, for being a sparring partner. You tell your story, and and your coach comes back and says, "So what about this?" Or "I'm curious about that," and just helps you think the process through. Some people say, "Oh, this sounds very much like therapy." It does, and very often, a psychologist will use the same questions as a coach. There is a subtle difference. A psychology is past looking, or a psychologist will be past looking. A coach is future looking. So coaches are future focused. We don't look at, we might sort of say, oh, well, that's interesting. You experienced that. And how is it having an effect on your behavior now and into the future? And this is what you need. You need this future focused, mirroring, sparring, support, empathy. You are as valued and as worth this as much as whoever is in your team or whoever is in your family. You're leading your life on a daily basis. So yes, of course, my answer would be find a coach. But you can also have this if you've got a really good friend. Just say, can we just spar about what I'm going through? Or, maybe you have that with your partner. Maybe have that with a parent. I don't know, but find someone, because if you look in the mirror, it's not going to come back at you. I have to say, auto coaching is nigh on impossible. Even a coach has a coach. And yes, coming through the crisis, I also have a coach.
It's helpful. I'm going to run down some key takeaways here real fast, and I'll give you, we have a question coming in from the group. I'll ask it and give you a moment to think about it while I go over the key takeaways. The question comes from Glenn, and he says, how do you help team members have a positive outlook, especially when in the middle of the crisis? Again, we don't know when it's going to end. We're far away from the docks when we left in the boat. So I'm going to run through the key takeaways here, give you a moment to think about it, and then we'll hand it back over to Lida. So basically, we need to prioritize the health and well-being for effective teamwork. So that needs to become your top priority, almost more so than the outputs. Yes, you still need to make sure that you're still managing the business, but you might need to shift the priorities a bit. You need to identify the human being versus the doing. So again, focus less on the output and what they're doing, but really identify who they are and try to communicate and really understand them so that you can have permission to have those conversations. Listen to the entire person, the whole person, not just what they're saying, but what they're not saying, the verbal cues, the visual cues, all of those things. Truly see your team members. You gave some good examples of, what do they have in their house? I gave my maybe not the best example of the rhinoceros photo, and I learned something there. So be sure that you're asking open-ended questions, use your curiosity, and ask really powerful questions. Reevaluate team values to fit in the moment. So again, stepping back, looking at that sort of team charter that you might have developed and really asking those questions of what matters to us, things that maybe were super important 4 months ago, maybe aren't quite as important as they are now compared to other things. Motivate from a place of empowerment. It's okay to be vulnerable. It's okay to listen. It's okay to not always have the answers, but you need to be responsible for motivating the team. And of course, you can't do all of the things on the screen here unless you're in touch with yourself, unless you're able to manage maybe the anxiety that you have. So speaking with a coach, speaking to a good friend or colleague. So we've got the question that I just gave you. So go ahead. How would you give someone a positive outlook real fast? And then we will take it back to Lida to wrap it up.
The thing that comes to mind is to help someone see a different perspective. And that is where your leadership skills come in, is to also have a positive perspective, see a positive perspective as well. If we take the metaphor of being, on the ship on the ocean and we can't see land behind us or land ahead of us, hey, we still have the ship. We're not drowning, as it were.
Yeah, and I think trying to find those moments, of things to celebrate. It's whether you're doing team pub quizzes or tomorrow for the team meeting, we have a funny background contest to see who can come up with the stupidest background. It sounds silly. At the end of the day, I think you still need to sort of be aware and acknowledge the situation so that we're not trying to sweep it under the rug. So I think that comes back to that authenticity. But at the same time, I think that it's from a leadership perspective, for me at least, it's a constant, I don't want to say battle because that's probably not the right characterization, but it's something that you need to have on your mind and to really make an effort for. And some people will be on board with you and, water rolls off their back. Others, it's going to affect them a little bit more. So you might have to give a little extra attention to those who are showing outwardly it's more effective. But at the same time, you need to have those visual cues to make sure that just because someone's not saying they're having an issue, that they don't have an issue.
It's basically just keeping your radar on all the time.
That's right. We're going to sneak in one last question here. It says, in the long-term online working situation, I'm feeling difficulty to make nonverbal communication or easy chit-chat with members day by day, which was very important for this person to understand the interpersonality of the other people. Any advice from a point of coaching? And this will be our last question. So how can we make those connections in this virtual world where I can't reach out and, put my hand on your shoulder and ask you how you're doing? Any tips that you've seen that have worked for you to try to make that connection?
Get curious. And yeah, we have to make the time. We have to make the time to call in. But when you call in, how are you? Fine. And then get to the business. That's not going to work. I start my conversations with, what's going on for you right now? Yeah. And then you invite someone to tell you, well, actually, I've got a cat under the table who's pawing my knee. And you can start from there, gee, what kind of cat have you got? Bring him up onto the table. I want to see your cat. It's about keeping the curiosity online constantly. And it takes a lot of energy and a lot of time. And it might take time out of the conversation or the hour that you've got booked online, but it's so worth it.
In our first session of MBA Talks, we did one on presentation design and presentation skills, and we have that on all of our different channels recorded, so you can go watch it on demand. Something else maybe for Yasushi, who asked this question. At the very end of that, we talk specifically about ways to engage with people in the online environment and some things that we've been doing, because we've always done a lot of online sessions as part of our jobs, but especially now, we're doing them now more than ever. So check that particular recording out. There might be some takeaways in there that you can have as well. Lida, I'm going to hand it back over to you. Thank you for giving us the opportunity to bring Hetty out to everyone, for her to share her experience. Again, I'm Brandon Kirby. I'm the Director for Marketing and Admissions here at Rotterdam School of Management, Erasmus University, for our MBA programs. And Lida, I'll hand it over to you to close it out.
Thank you, Brandon. And time really flew by. I can't believe it's been an hour. So first of all, a big thank you to Hetty for being with us today. Thank you for sharing your experience, for encouraging us to be vulnerable and open, and for sharing so many relevant examples from your hours of coaching with countless business leaders throughout your career. Also, a big thank you to Brandon.
I've really appreciated having the opportunity to talk about this. And yes, the time did fly by. I could talk about this for hours, but I really appreciated the opportunity to come here this evening and then to share some of my experience. And
maybe we'll have you again with us soon.
Whatever, you just ask.
Also, thank you for Brandon for facilitating superbly this discussion today, for your insightful questions as well, and for also self-reflecting on your experience as a team leader as well.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Finally, of course, thank you to everyone for joining us today, for sharing your questions, your concerns on how to lead teams. We will be sending you a follow-up email with a recording of the event. We will be including the link for some other RSM webinars that relate to some questions that you had and that Brandon mentioned, maybe the things that relate to how effectively communicate in this new virtual reality. And of course, we look forward to seeing you in our future events. So we do have another Executive MBA Talk scheduled for September. We will be publicizing the date soon. The topic will be related to our Career Services Department. Of course, we have our MBA Open Day on Saturday, August 1st, and we will have a behind-the-scenes talk with our alumni of our Executive MBA program on September 1st. So thank you very much for joining us today, and hopefully see you again soon.